Good day and welcome to the end of our Energy in Africa series. I'm your host, Tania Habimana. This series looked at the energy industry in Africa and what it will take to make the leap to cleaner energy. We've spoken to experts in various parts of the industry that walked us through financing energy development in Africa and the strategies required to make the leap to cleaner energy. We delved deeper into the policy, law and regulation and even explored the kind of leadership needed to drive the necessary technological advancements. Today, we focus on innovation and sustainability as key considerations in building a more sustainable future. Joining me right now to bring this series to a close are Professor Lwazi Ngubevana, the Director of the African Energy Leadership Center at the Wits Business School in Johannesburg, and James McKay, Associate Director, Energy Strategy and Infrastructure at PwC. Welcome. So, Professor Lwazi, you have a number of years' experience in the energy sector and you sit on a few expert panels. I'd like to hear from you, lay it out for us. What are the biggest challenges that African nations face when it comes to developing sustainable energy?
Well, thanks, Tania. Thanks for having me. Look, that's obviously a very, very broad question. But I do think in terms of developing sustainable solutions, one of our biggest challenges is to raise financing to develop our own locally, or implement our locally developed solutions. I think that is a very, very big challenge for the continent. I do think that in terms of sustainability, there's a number of reasons why we are struggling with developing sustainable solutions. I think amongst which is the implementation of existing environmental regulations in the different countries. I think that we need to build capacity to be able to implement those regulations. We've seen them flouted in a number of jurisdictions with absolutely no consequences. But I also think that we, as a continent, we've got a growing population. We've got a population that's migrating from rural to urban areas, and it puts a lot of pressure on our systems and our ability to develop sustainable solutions. That's just but two, I think, of some of the biggest challenges that we face.
Thank you. And James, you also have quite a number of years' experience, especially in developing strategies for energy infrastructure. What do you have to add to this? Are you in agreement? Do you have anything, any other challenges that you've observed?
Yeah, thank you. I think that Africa is in a unique position because it has a double challenge of both energy transition as well as energy poverty. And these numbers are well documented. I think Africa's 1.4 billion people, of which over 40% have no access to electricity, and they estimate that sort of at 600 million people who don't have sustainable energy. So I think putting that aside, because that is a historic position, the next thing is actually to deal with this energy transition, which I think, as the Prophet said, it's unaffordable to many African economies who are also suffering from post-COVID sort of fiscal pressure. What's going to compound that affordability is that we know that 2/3 probably of African utilities and grids have underinvestment, are poorly maintained, and need significant recapitalizing. So it's not just about the generation or building new generation. It's actually about the entire ecosystem around energy. We've just done some modeling. We've said for Africa to decarbonize its energy sector would cost about $2.8 trillion by 2050. Which clearly, the end users, we don't have cost-reflective tariffs largely in Africa, and it's not just the generation, but it's the whole ecosystem. So how will Africa pay for that 2.8 trillion? And that's really the question is, to what extent, we've seen a lot of us call it COP26, but to what extent will the developed world really be able to come to the party and say, well, we're going to give large, chunks of green financing or some green financing support. And it can't just be loans, because the country balance sheet and the utility balance sheets, Eskom in South Africa is a prime example. Eskom balance sheets can't carry significant new debt. even if it is concessional financing.
And you make some pretty good points there, and I'd like to come back to that energy gap, the energy funding gap, the 2.8 trillion that Africa needs to be able to make a clean transition. But before we get to there, Professor, I'd like to ask you, what is the case for sustainability when we look at the fact that we are energy poor, as James just mentioned? Does sustainability even make sense when we look at the continent?
Well, it depends on how you define sustainability to begin with. But I do think sustainability absolutely makes sense. There's nothing that says we can't develop sustainably. There's nothing that says development means we need to destroy the environment, and that, how can I put it? We can grow and grow in a less carbon intensive manner. We can protect the environment while growing. So we can absolutely do it. But I think, as James has pointed out, the challenge really is the financing. How are we going to finance this growth? The developed world has grown on the back of fossil fuels. And now the same developed world is saying Africa must forget about fossil fuels. Now, part of the challenge with that I have is we're going to import renewable technologies. The jobs that we create, with renewable energy technologies are temporary in the main. Now the question is, do we give up our fossil fuels because the, first world says so, or do we continue use in what I think would be a fair and equitable manner for us to get to the level where we're able to compete and we're able to grow cleaner? And I think that's a really, really difficult question to answer.
And when you mention fair and equitable manner, are you referring to energy efficiency as opposed to energy sustainability?
Well, it needs to be a combination of both. That we need to be sustainable. We can't grow without energy. At the same time, we need to make sure that we protect our environment. And I think that everyone needs to play their part. I do think that the developed world needs to essentially pay for what they've done. They need to pay for the damage that they've done. And this is where it becomes very controversial, unfortunately. But I do think Africa needs to take a stand and say we are going to grow clean. We are going to make sure that we provide energy for our people. But at the same time, we will not carry the burden for what others have done.
And that's quite a statement. And James, earlier was mentioned the fact that jobs within the energy sector are temporary, that it's very expensive to implement. How feasible is it for African governments to adopt this?
I think that it's not just feasible, it's an absolute must. So maybe, again, just taking a lead from the Prof there and a step back. Saving the planet is a non-negotiable. I don't think that it's an option that we can say we're not going to transition. And anyone in the world who thinks that we're not on a net zero journey, I think is very mistaken. The question really is how quick we can transition. Okay, and Africa specifically has some big funding constraints. It absolutely is not of Africa's making. Africa is contributed about roughly 3% of cumulative emissions globally. So clearly it's not at Africa's doorstep that we have this climate change problem. And so there is an obligation on the developed world who benefited and created those emissions to come to the party. But I suppose the key question then is, well, how do they come to the party and what is Africa going to put on the table? So if you ask, what will Africa put on the table? What we've seen is that 35 out of 54 African countries have made commitments towards net zero and are saying that they will transition towards a green future. So I think that that's a very positive. One of the key parts of creating some transition finance is a credible plan that says how. So if the sort of the trade-off is winners and losers of coal versus renewable energy, then we're creating this disconnect where I think transition finance is extremely difficult. The developed world is not going to have confidence in a robust governance, accountability, and a transition project plan. The renewable energy, I think it's important just to make this point as well. It is no longer a debate whether renewable energy is cheaper or better. It is very clear. And we've even seen in South Africa in our recent bid window 5, renewable energy on wind and solar, the lowest priced bids were coming in cheaper than just the cost of coal in Eskom's primary energy income statement. So it is cheaper to build new wind and solar than just to operate existing coal plants. So renewable energy does not need subsidies. It's commercially viable. It is the lowest risk because it's decentralized. You create more jobs. I mean, we've just looked at the net zero rundown of fossil fuels. Potentially, what we've estimated in Africa would cost about 1.3 million jobs directly in the oil and gas industry. But the renewable ramp up would create probably 2 to 3 times that amount. Now, those are not one-to-one jobs, and so one has to have again a plan, a robust plan that says, how do we look after communities and workers who are stranded in maybe oil and gas or oil and coal specifically? I think gas has got a much longer lifespan. And that's not the same as the flurry of interest in international developers who are all running around making great businesses, doing, investing in renewable generation across Africa. So I do think that Africa does need to play a much stronger part, make stronger commitments. But I also agree with the Prof. I mean, the developed world do need to contribute financially for the benefit of the cumulative emissions that they have used as an economic and financial asset. Thanks.
Absolutely, thank you. And let's talk about innovation. Let's talk about new eras of energy generating technologies. Professor, what have you noticed in the sector?
Part. I mean, there's been great innovations, particularly in the wind sector. But the sad part for me is that not much has been coming from the African continent. And I think for me, I put I don't say the blame, but the responsibility, I think, at governments. Because one of the things that, for example, we face as a challenge in South Africa is you've got funding available for basic research at university level, for example. And then you can take that research, there's still funding available to piloting phase. But then the difficulty comes then when you have to cross over from piloting, to actual commercialization. And there's a big gap. Venture funding has not come to the party, at least not to the level that it should. I think just private equity as a whole has not played its part, and governments have also set back. And so there's a big gap between piloting and actually commercialization of technologies. And that is a big problem. And as a result, the continent is struggling to bring out its own innovations. There's lots of bright people, there's lots of great ideas, but quite frankly, they don't reach commercial stage.
That is such an important point, the point of innovation, research and development for the energy sector from the African continent. And James, I'd like to ask you, do you agree with this? Are we investing enough in research and development on the continent, and what can we do to make sure that we take these innovations from piloting to commercialization?
Agreed. No, I do agree with it. I think maybe to kind of, again, just be a little bit practical. So in terms of clean tech, I mean, there are 4 key sort of technologies which have to be scaled out at huge increases over the next sort of 2 to 3 decades. If we look, our estimate is that to decarbonize Africa's current energy system, Africa needs to scale up PV 110 times its current base. So Africa currently has wind and PV, makes up only 1.6% of Africa's energy. So the scale up, and really the technology is going to be PV, wind, storage, and hydrogen. Now, Africa can benefit from the domestic ramp up. I mean, we've spoken about the challenge of finance, but I do agree, we need better master plans. We need a lot more investment and in the front end research and design, skills development. I think we need better international strategies around technology relationships and partnerships. So we should be attracting international OEMs and technology providers into Africa, because the market opportunity for scaling up in Africa is huge. I mean, if you look at that, the ability long term to build out that amount of those clean tech markets, they've got to be attractive. And we shouldn't be just importing finished products into Africa. We really should be driving that ourselves. So we need better master plan, better sector coupling understanding. We need international partnerships around technology. And government needs to play a very strong role in driving that and investing in the front end of establishing those platforms. Thanks.
That's a very important point. And I saw a report by the CCUS that actually said that globally, the share of R&D spending by the public sector is declining, and the share of R&D spent by the private sector is rising. So what about the private sector? What about companies on the continent? Are they investing in R&D towards clean energy? Professor?
They certainly are. I mean, if you look at a company like Sasol, for example, that have come out very publicly to speak about their journey towards green hydrogen. So there certainly is investment. There's companies such as Bambili who now decided they're going well ahead and investing in skills development. Again, this is for a green hydrogen future. So there's many other examples. So there certainly is investment from the private sector, but it really does need a partnership with government. There's no way the private sector can do this alone. In much the same that the public sector and the private sector, actually we need each other. There's no way of getting around it. We need public institutions of higher learning to be involved in the process as well, because this is where great ideas come from. And so we need to work together on this journey. But I do feel that Africa has got great resources and that we should be leveraging those. A clean future for the entire globe needs Africa's resources either way. And we need to leverage off those to ensure that we are able to invest in ourselves, in our own development.
Exactly. And James, I'd like to ask you about policy. Are the policies that we currently have in place on the continent appropriate to accelerate the transition towards cleaner energy?
Difficult question. I suppose the hard answer I would say is no. We I think struggle to have a sufficiently robust public environment around attracting foreign direct investment, around creating business confidence that really stimulates private sector to take risk and invest. We see the large public procurement programs are not sustainable. We need competitive markets, and competitive markets have to be based on open competition with transparency, accountability, a lot of robustness. I think there's a lot of commitment, and we're certainly seeing in South Africa the target is to get there. If we look at the unbundling of Eskom to create an ISMO, there are efforts to create a ring-fenced single buyer model, not a single buyer model, but an independent system operator. So to allow competitive trading of energy and energy markets. We see that I think the JSE are busy at the moment looking at trying to work out how to establish a wholesale and a retail trading market. These are the type of reforms that are needed in order to be able to create a competitive sort of market environment around energy and move the investment off the country balance sheet and off the host country's on-budget spend into the private sector. Because there's no reason why the private sector shouldn't be investing in these technologies and developing them. So I think that there's a lot of work to be done. But in general, I don't think Africa is seen as sufficiently coordinated, and policy coherence is often a little bit lacking, and governance is often seen as a little bit weak.
Thank you. And Professor, what are your thoughts on this, on the policy required to accelerate innovation towards a transition to cleaner energy?
needs to create a conducive environment for private sector to invest. I do think that coherence, as is mentioned, I mean, we've got, rather, how can I put it, infamous examples of, the left hand saying A and the right hand saying something completely different between, and this is within government itself and SOEs. And I think this is problematic. But I also think that from a coordination point of view, our policy development needs to start thinking outside of country boundaries. I think we still need to start thinking wider and thinking of the region. Let's think of, for example, how we make effective use of our power pools within the continent to ensure sustainability, but also just in the planning itself and how we develop as a collective and not just as isolated independent states. So I do think that really is quite critical. Capital will always follow where there's money to be made. And so really governments rather need to step up and create conducive policy environments. Yes, we've got examples of what I think is success. Our renewable energy procurement process has been lauded world over really over its transparency and also over its competitiveness. And as a result, we've seen prices being falling dramatically over the years, over the different bidding periods. So I think that is a good thing. Yes, there has been some questions around governance that have been raised. We've got, for example, court cases that's ongoing around these very issues. And so, yes, we do need to make sure that we tighten up around governance in particular. And that builds confidence, that builds investor confidence. And I think that certainty gets, much better improved. And if we can provide certainty to investors that you bring in your money, we're going to be transparent, how it's spent, where it's spent, and that the processes are, completely transparent. Everyone is competitive, and accountability at the end of it all. I think we will be in a much better state.
That's a very good point. James, I have a question for you. When it comes to investor confidence, we've seen that the presence of patents and, properly protected intellectual property helps investors have more confidence in countries and projects and innovations. Are we protected on the continent?
Maybe just to also tag back onto the previous discussion, I think it's important to maybe differentiate, around the technology portions. So yes, private sector's investing, but I don't think that as Africa, and certainly and like as South Africa, we are not going to be at the forefront of the real technology innovation. And when one looks across the board, all those clean techs that I've mentioned, the increases and improvements in solar efficiency translation, building new storage without certain materials that are more expensive and more difficult, so without cobalt, even without lithium. So those levels of innovation, I think we should leave to the developed world who have got scale, big finance, big subsidies. Where we can really start to make a difference, and if we look at it in South Africa, our automotive sector has been hugely successful, makes up nearly 15% of our GDP. We don't design those cars, but we do a fantastic job of building them, creates a lot of jobs, a lot of economic benefit, and a lot of revenue. So what we do need is international technology relationships and partnerships, and we've got to invest in those. So we've got to get to the OEMs, and we've got to show that in Africa or South Africa, wherever we think we want to bring those technologies through, that we have a compelling business case and an argument that says this is good business. There's a good domestic market, there's a good export market. We will support and create an ecosystem which is good for investment. If we can do that, and I don't think we need protection for that, because really we're not the primary developers of intellectual property at that high-end tech scale. So I think maybe if I can answer in that way.
Very, very good point, actually, very good point. And I like that you specify the differences in technology and innovation and where exactly is our competitive advantage and what our country should be striving for. Professor, in closing, what are your thoughts when it comes to best practices? Who's getting it right?
Yeah, that's a tough one. um, Look, I think that we we've got an opportunity to get it right. I think we're all learning. I don't think anybody can say with any great sense of confidence that they have absolutely got it perfectly. You've seen, for example, in Europe, you've seen America, they started on a journey of decarbonization, but then they've now had to revert back to using more coal, um, just because, the energy demands and other factors really, such as weather, have affected the process. So I think we're all learning, but I do think we would be wise to think very carefully about the steps that we take, and be very measured in our approach in how we decarbonize, to ensure that we sustain jobs. I think that's absolutely critical. In fact, not just sustain, but grow jobs, because we've got high levels of unemployment, high levels of inequality. And so we really need to be very, very careful. And we need to be clear that we've got these natural resources, and we've got to make use of them. It doesn't help us to completely abandon our natural resources at our own peril. I really think it serves nobody, and the continent needs to be very careful in how we go about this.
And James, on your side, any closing thoughts, best practice?
Well, when you ask who's getting it right, I would say no one. Very clearly, I think we get into this false sense of security that 1.5 degrees global warming is quite good. It's really not. And we're currently probably at 2.5, so somewhere between 2.3 and 2.7, depending on what pledges. So the world's not getting it right. We should be, at least at 1.5, if not lower, and even 1.5 is going to have serious implications for Africa and for the planet. So I suppose a closing question or sort of point for me is that we have two moral dilemmas. One is we have to save the planet, and it's a non-negotiable. So we have to transition, we have to move to renewable energy. However, that is a long-term moral issue. We also have a short-term moral issue, which is quality of lives and sustaining people now. And so the transition makes that very difficult, because to a certain extent, we end up having to sacrifice one or the other. And we've got to work out how to transition sustainably and effectively and optimize both those moral positions. It's going to be expensive, it's going to be complicated, but we've really got to be very principled and very kind of driven towards, trying to do the best we can at all countries, all citizens, and all people of this planet. Thank you.
Wow. Well, surely that was a vast topic that we can definitely explore in more detail. But unfortunately, that is where we will have to leave and bring this series to a close. I want to thank my guests who joined me today, Professor Lwazi Ngubevana, the Director of the African Leadership Center at the Wits Business School in Johannesburg, and James McKay, Associate Director, Energy Strategy and Infrastructure at PwC. And big thanks to you, our audience, who followed us during this series. Have a great day.